They say libraries are for the quiet ones, the thinkers, the ones who whisper through the world, leaving barely a trace. But in the winter of 2012, in a snowbound corner of Vermont, one library found its voice, thanks to a creature who could never speak. It began, as many strange things do, with a cold morning and a locked door that shouldn't have been ajar. Eleanor Reed had opened the old Westwood Library every Tuesday for 17 years. She liked the routine, the creak of the front latch, the smell of books still holding the breath of last winter's wood smoke. At 58, she had grown into her quiet life the way ivy grows into brick, slowly, stubbornly, and without complaint. But that morning was different. There, on the narrow concrete landing behind the library's side door, was a shape, curled, still, not quite dead, not quite alive. At first, she thought it was a large dog, the way its fur fanned in thick silver clumps. But as she stepped closer, careful not to crunch the snow beneath her boots too loudly, she saw the truth. A lynx, fur matted with frost, one ear bloodied, the other twitching just barely enough to betray life. Its sides heaved, slow and shallow, and one pale yellow eye opened, just enough to meet hers. And for a moment, neither of them moved. "Are you real?" She wasn't talking to the animal, because for the first time in years, something stirred in her. Not pity, not fear, recognition. Two survivors in the dead of winter, one frozen on the outside, the other on the inside. And so, against every rule, every bit of logic, and every whisper of doubt that tried to hold her back, she bent down, opened her coat wide, and cradled the wild thing like it was her own. Inside the library, the radiator ticked. The morning light crept through frosted panes. And a story neither of them expected was about to begin. One that would thaw a heart, stir a town, and prove that sometimes the quietest lives carry the loudest echoes. The library had never known such a secret. Eleanor placed the Lynx, still breathing but barely, on a woolen blanket laid across the floor of the small, drafty staff lounge behind the checkout desk. It was the only room in the building with a space heater that didn't groan louder than a freight train. She pulled the blind shut, locked the door, and posted a handwritten sign on the knob, "Maintenance, do not enter." It wasn't a lie. Something was being repaired in that room, though it wasn't the plumbing. She stayed late that day, well past the usual closing hour of 5 o'clock. She brewed tea, dipped clean rags in warm water, and gently wiped the crusted frost from the lynx's paws. The animal didn't resist, only watched her, warily, its eyes wide and ancient, as if trying to remember whether it had known kindness before. "We'll keep this between us, she whispered, placing a shallow dish of water beside him. She named him quietly in her head. Ash, for the soft gray hue of his coat and the way he seemed to have risen from the cold ruins of the woods. Each day, she'd slip in and tend to him. A few strips of raw chicken from the grocery store, soft towels, a small space heater humming beside the filing cabinet. She began reading to him, not aloud, not at first, just quietly, turning pages of wildlife encyclopedias, murmuring facts as if to herself. But by the third night, when Ash shifted his weight and placed one paw slowly across the hem of her skirt, something changed. "Did you know?" she began, clearing her throat. "Lynx have fur-covered feet like snowshoes? Helps them walk on drifts without sinking?" The next night she brought a book of poems. The one after that, stories of wilderness survival. It became their ritual, woman and wildcat, learning each other's silence. But no secret lasts forever in a small town. One Thursday afternoon, as the snow started falling again, and Eleanor fumbled with the key to the staff door, she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Reed? What's that in the window?" She turned. It was Toby Markham, age 9, nose red from the cold, backpack slipping off one shoulder. He pointed to the fogged window beside the break room. There, framed in the square of glass, were two golden eyes blinking slowly from behind a stack of old printer paper. "Oh, that's just a display," Eleanor stammered, stepping in front of him. "Part of a wildlife education program." "Cool, can we see it?" Scene 4, The Secret Spreads. She laughed, too sharply, and shooed him along to the children's section, but it was too late. The word Lynx passed from Toby to his mother, from his mother to the pastor's wife, and from her lips to the entire church coffee circle by Sunday morning. By Monday, folks were stopping by the library just to linger, not for books, but for glimpses. Scene 5, The Town's Concern, and Eleanor could feel the shift in the way people looked at her, with curiosity, yes, but also something else. Concern, caution. She knew what they were thinking. A wild animal? In a library? Scene 6, Trust in Ash. But she also knew what she had seen in Ash's eyes. Not threat, not danger, trust. Still, the whispers grew louder than the bookshelves ever had. And late that night, after wiping down Ash's paws and reading one final chapter on the behavior of solitary predators, Eleanor sat on the floor beside him. Snow piled at the windows like silent spectators. "They're going to want you gone," she said softly. "They're going to say I've lost my mind. Maybe I have. But if this feeling, if it's madness, then I think I needed it." Ash blinked once, slowly, deliberately, and laid his head on her boot. That was the night Eleanor made a decision. If the town wanted to talk, let them. She would give them something worth talking about.
The following week, the snow didn't let up. It fell in lazy sheets over Westwood, blanketing porches and burying fences until the whole town looked like it had been pressed into silence. But inside the library, the silence was different. It had weight. Eleanor felt it when she unlocked the front door and saw the group of women from the church auxiliary pretending to browse the travel section. She felt it when the local fire chief just happened to be in the neighborhood and lingered by the circulation desk, making small talk that wandered too close to the staff lounge. "Wild animals belong in the woods, not next to children's story time," he said casually, fingers tapping the counter. That night she found a folded note slipped under the staff door. "This is not safe. If you care about the community, you'll do the right thing." Ash had begun to regain strength. He moved now, slowly but with purpose, pacing the lounge when the building was closed. His ears twitched at every creak, every whisper of wind through the eaves. But he never snarled, never clawed, just watched. So did Eleanor. And that weekend, the town finally made its move. The Westwood Community Hall hadn't seen this many bodies since the 4th of July potluck. The chairs were arranged in neat rows beneath the string lights Eleanor had helped hang back in 06. Now they flickered overhead like weak stars. Folks leaned in murmuring, wrapped in coats and tension. Eleanor stood near the back at first, but when the topic of wild animal containment and public safety was added to the agenda, she stepped forward. The moderator, a broad-shouldered man named Hank Lister, cleared his throat. "There have been concerns," he said, "about a lynx allegedly being kept at the Westwood Library." "It's not allegedly," said a woman near the front. "My daughter said she saw it, right through the window." A rustle of agreement moved through the room like wind through brittle leaves. "What if it attacks a child? This isn't a zoo, it's a public institution." Eleanor took a breath. She hadn't spoken publicly in years, not since the funeral. But now she felt something different rise up. Not panic, but clarity. She stepped to the front, hands clasped in front of her. Not defiant, just firm. "Eleanor, you're right, I brought a lynx into the library," gasps. One sharp whisper. "Someone." She admitted it. "Eleanor, I didn't do it to cause fear," she continued. "I did it because I found a living creature in need of help. He was dying, and I knew I had the time and the space to give him a second chance." She paused, looked around, saw faces shift, some softening, some hardening. "Eleanor, but something happened I didn't expect. That animal, Ash, I've called him. He's taught me more in the past few weeks than I've learned in years. About resilience, observation, patience." A hush fell. "Eleanor, I'm not asking for permission to keep a wild animal," Eleanor said. "He'll return to the wild soon, but I'm asking for your blessing to create something lasting from this experience." Eleanor looked around the room, really looked. There was Toby in the second row clutching a notebook, Mrs. DeSoto from the cafe who always brought in muffins when her husband wasn't watching carbs, And near the back, even the fire chief, arms crossed but listening now. "I want to start an animal education corner," she said. "Books, presentations, guest speakers. Maybe a rescue group comes once a month. Maybe we partner with the ranger station. I'm not suggesting we house wild animals. I'm suggesting we learn from them. Because if we teach children how to care, maybe they'll grow into adults who know how to protect what matters." For a long beat, no one said anything. Then a voice spoke up from the back. It was Mr. Hartley, the retired science teacher who hadn't attended a meeting in years. "I donate my old field journals," he said, raising one hand, and slowly others followed. "I have a projector for wildlife slides. My cousin works in rehab for birds of prey. She could give a talk." By the end of the night, Eleanor walked out into the snow not with victory, but with possibility. Back at the library, Ash was waiting, curled in his corner, eyes glowing in the dim light. She sat beside him, her knees cracking as she knelt. "You were never the danger," she whispered. "You were the question we were afraid to ask." The snow kept falling, but the silence had changed. Now it held space for something new, a voice, once quiet, now heard. Winter had a way of stretching time in Vermont. The days felt slow and still, like the library itself, timeless until someone decided to dust off the silence. Eleanor had made her decision, and now, she had to build it. The next morning she came in early, earlier than usual. The sky still dark, the street still empty. She unlocked the front doors, flipped on the lights, and stepped into her small kingdom of worn wooden shelves and whispered dreams. But this time she didn't head straight for the staff lounge. Instead, she walked to the far back corner of the library, a dusty alcove no one had cared about in years. It had once been the biography section, long since abandoned. Books sat crooked on the shelves, ignored and unloved. She stood there for a long time, arms crossed over her cardigan. Then she smiled. "This'll do just fine." It began that afternoon. She moved the shelves, cleaned the windows, posted a sign, "Coming soon." The Wildlife Discovery Corner. There was no budget, no committee, just Eleanor, her cart of hand-picked books, and an idea that had started with a half-frozen creature and grown into something neither of them could have predicted. She put up hand-drawn posters about local species, foxes, moose, owls, pinned photographs of wildlife tracks. She borrowed an old slide projector from Mr. Hartley and began assembling a small display on animal behaviors, habitats, and the importance of protecting native species. Each day someone new wandered in, a curious parent, a scout leader, kids eager to help color posters. They didn't always understand what Eleanor was building, but they felt something shift. The library wasn't just a place you visited, it was becoming a place you experienced. Ash, meanwhile, had grown stronger. He slept less, prowled more. His eyes followed Eleanor with quiet recognition, not quite tame, but not wild anymore either. And Eleanor knew what was coming. He was almost ready. The decision pressed down on her. Would she let him go? After all this time? Could she? "You were never mine," she told him one night, crouched beside him in the soft orange glow of the desk lamp. "You were just passing through, like a good story." That night she left the back door unlatched. The next morning, the room was empty. No blood, no struggle, just a dent in the blanket and a paw print in the snow, fading beneath new flakes. He was gone. But in the space he left behind, something else had taken root, a new kind of presence, a story that would stay, long after the tracks had vanished.
For a few quiet weeks, it seemed like the storm had passed. The Wildlife Discovery Corner was no longer just a corner. It had grown, slowly, steadily, into something real. Books donated by neighbors, field sketches from old naturalists, a pinboard where children posted their own animal drawings, and beside them, a small quote Eleanor had written in delicate script. "When we learn to care, we also learn to teach." It was simple, honest, and it worked, for a while. But small towns, like wild animals, don't always stay tame. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday. Eleanor arrived early, as always. Snow still clung to the windowsills. But taped to the front door, flapping in the wind like a warning, was a letter. Official town seal stamped at the top, "To whom it may concern." Due to community concern and pending liability questions regarding wildlife-related programming at a public institution, the town council will be reviewing the continued operation of the Wildlife Discovery Corner. Until further notice, all animal-related displays and activities are suspended. Her breath caught. She read it again, and then again, suspended, not revoked, not dismantled, but frozen, like Ash had once been, barely alive, waiting. Inside, the books still waited on their shelves, The drawings still fluttered on the board, but now it all felt fragile. She tried to focus, kept shelving, organizing, answering phone calls, but all day questions hung in the air like stale dust. Is it true they're shutting it down? Did something happen? Was someone hurt? No, she told them. No one had been hurt. But fear didn't need a reason, just a whisper. The next morning, the local newspaper ran a story on the front page. Wild ideas at the library, has education gone too far? The article quoted a few townspeople, none by name, expressing concern that impressionable children were being encouraged to glorify dangerous animals. One even suggested that Eleanor had become emotionally unstable since losing her husband 5 years earlier. She read that part twice, not because it hurt, but because it was cowardly and cruel. That night, she stayed late. The lights were dim. The wind howled outside, scratching frost against the windows like claws. Eleanor stood in front of the display board and slowly began to take things down. One by one, the drawings, the maps, the article she'd printed about tracking lynx populations in New England. She didn't cry, but when she reached to take down her handwritten quote, the one the children had started copying into their notebooks, her hand paused. She didn't remove it. She couldn't, because this wasn't over. The next town meeting was louder, angrier. A group of parents demanded that the library return to its original purpose. One woman accused Eleanor of blurring the line between fact and fantasy. Another man claimed his son refused to study math because he only cared about foxes now. Eleanor stood again, not because she wanted to, because no one else would. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She simply asked a question. How many of your children have asked a question about nature in the past month? Silence. How many of them have come home and opened a book they didn't have to read? More silence. We say we want them to be curious, to grow, to become something more than what they see on a screen. And then, the moment they begin to wonder aloud, we tell them to stop, because it's messy, because it's uncomfortable, because we're afraid. She looked at the council, then back at the crowd. Fear is not an education, it's the absence of one. A few heads nodded, not many, but enough. Still, the council voted to suspend the program, pending further review. Eleanor walked home alone that night. Snow falling heavy, not soft like before, but sharp, cold. She thought about Ash, about how easily wild things vanished when no one believed they belonged. Eleanor, VO. Maybe they're right, she whispered into the wind. Maybe I went too far. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Because what she'd created wasn't dangerous, it was alive. And some people didn't know how to live with that. The next morning, Eleanor unlocked the doors as usual. But this time, she didn't go to the wildlife corner. She went to the children's section, sat in the low chair by the window, and opened a book on mountain ecosystems. Soon, a child came and sat across from her, then another, and another. Child, VO. Are you going to read? Eleanor. VO. She smiled, only if you promise to ask questions. And so she read. And for those few moments, in a small, snow-covered town, knowledge refused to be silenced. It had been 17 days since the Wildlife Discovery Corner was suspended. 17 mornings of showing up, shelving books, reading aloud, answering questions with a smile, even though part of Eleanor had gone quiet inside. Not angry, not defeated, just still. Ash had been gone for months now, no sign, no sighting, just a paw print in snow, long since melted. Sometimes she questioned if she had imagined it all. The bond, the transformation, the wonder. Maybe she had only projected her own longing onto a creature that had never really belonged to her. But then came the fog. That morning, the world outside the library disappeared under a thick, low mist, the kind that erases time and place until everything feels like memory. Eleanor opened the doors as usual, but something in the air felt different, colder, quieter, like the earth itself was holding its breath. At 9:17 in the morning, a boy named Noah, a fourth grader who'd once asked Eleanor if foxes could fall in love, came sprinting into the library, cheeks flushed, eyes wide. Noah, VO. Miss Reed, he gasped. There's something outside. She followed him without thinking. Through the front doors, across the walkway, past the old cedar tree at the edge of the property. And there, Just beyond the frost-covered shrubs, where the woods began to reclaim the land, stood a shape. Still, poised, watching. Ash. Not a dream, not a shadow, but Ash. His silver coat dusted with frost, his breath clouding the air, his eyes locked with hers. He didn't move. Neither did she. It was as if time folded, and the weeks, the whispers, the bureaucracy all fell away. For one brief moment, it was just the two of them again. Two survivors, two teachers, two souls who had crossed paths when they needed it most. "Eleanor," soft whisper. "You found your way back?" she whispered, not knowing if the words were for him or for herself. And then, he turned. Silent as mist, he slipped into the trees, his body vanishing between trunks like a breath returning to the forest. But he left something behind. Paw prints in the thin snow, a single tuft of gray fur caught on a branch. And in Eleanor's chest, a heartbeat she hadn't felt in weeks. By noon, the children had gathered again. The fog had begun to lift. And when Eleanor told them what she had seen, they didn't laugh. They didn't question. They believed. Because they had seen what Eleanor had helped them see all along. Not just animals, but meaning. Later that day, without asking permission, Eleanor pinned a new photo on the community board. It was an old one, taken during Ash's recovery. His face turned slightly, his amber eyes filled with light. Some stories don't end. They echo. That evening, a council member stopped by quietly, a man who had voted against her. He glanced at the display, then at her. "Council member, I heard about the sighting." Eleanor said nothing, but the man nodded once. "Council member? Maybe we were wrong to stop it. Maybe it's time we let the wild back in just a little." And with that, he left a folded slip of paper on the counter, a revised motion to reinstate the program, subject to review, of course. But still, a start. Eleanor didn't smile. She didn't need to. The smile was in the children's voices as they read aloud from field guides, in the drawings pinned like prayers to the corkboard, in the space Ash had filled, then left behind. A space now brimming with wonder. Spring came late that year. The snow melted in quiet drips, as if reluctant to let go. Birds returned, hesitant at first, then bold with song. And the Westwood Library, once a forgotten corner of town, had become something else entirely. Not louder, not grander, but alive. The Wildlife Discovery Corner had been officially reinstated, this time with town support, modest funding, and a calendar of monthly programs. A local wildlife rehabilitator offered to speak. A former park ranger donated artifacts. Even the skeptical council members began to show up, asking questions, bringing their grandchildren. But no one called it Eleanor's project anymore. Because it wasn't. It belonged to the town now, to the children who begged for new books on bobcats and beavers, to the teenagers who started volunteering, leading mini presentations, to the parents who said, with a touch of surprise, "Parent, VO, he's never been this excited about reading before." And Eleanor? She did what she had always done. She kept the lights on. She kept the shelves full. She kept showing up, rain or shine, fog or frost, ready to share a story or listen to one. But something had changed. The woman who once blended into the background now stood at the front of classrooms, invited by teachers to speak about conservation and compassion. The widow who once spoke only in whispers now recorded a podcast for the library's website. Gentle reflections about the seasons, the animals of Vermont, and the lessons we often miss in our rush to be certain. Every so often, someone would still ask about Ash. "Child, do you think he'll ever come back?" She always answered the same way. "Eleanor." He never left. Because Ash had become more than fur and bone. He had become memory, metaphor, meaning. His brief, quiet presence had stirred something wild and kind in a place where silence had long gone unquestioned. And sometimes, on very still mornings before the library opened, Eleanor would walk to the edge of the woods and wait. Not expecting, just listening. And if she listened hard enough, she swore she could hear a rustle. A paw against snow, a breath against wind. We don't always choose when change comes. Sometimes it arrives frozen and half alive on your doorstep. And sometimes you don't save it. It saves you. Eleanor had believed once that her best years were behind her, that her life was a long, quiet chapter others skipped over. But she had been wrong, because it turned out, quiet doesn't mean empty. It means listening. It means learning. it means holding space for something new to grow. In saving a creature, she had awakened a community, and in teaching others to care, she had found something worth living for. Maybe you've had an ash in your life, a moment, a creature, a person that changed your direction without warning. Something unexpected, quiet, yet unforgettable. Or maybe you are someone's ash. When we learn to care, we also learn to teach. And when we choose to open a door to a creature, a child, a stranger, a truth, we never walk back through it the same. Not quieter, just stronger. If this story stirred something in you, share it. Tell someone, or better yet, ask a question. Open a book, start a new corner in your life. Because wonder is waiting. And it's always closer than you think.